My name is Emily Perlmeter, and I'm with the Dallas Fed, and I am also one of the conference organizers. So when we started initially talking about having this conference, it was more than a year ago, back when Mandy was actually on board with us at HousingWorks, we knew that we wanted to have this local conversation to kind of set the context, and then we knew we wanted to have someone to enhance that, who could speak to issues nationally. And we knew that Rolf Pendall was the perfect person. Rolf is an Institute Fellow at the Urban Institute in the Metropolitan Housing and Community Policy Center. He's got 25 years of experience, more than that really, in urban growth and development issues, including land planning, affordable housing policy, metropolitan growth patterns, racial residential segregation, and concentration of poverty. And as I talked to him a little bit about last night, also how transit and transportation plays into those issues, which we know here in Austin is a really big concern for us. So prior to being at the Urban Institute, he was a professor at Cornell. He holds a PhD in city and regional planning from the University of California at Berkeley. And perhaps most importantly, he has 2 master's degrees from UT Austin. Rolf?
Thanks very much. I'm going to pace around a bit here on the stage. And let's see. Yep, we're working here. So my talk is called The Cost of Segregation, National Trends from 1990 to 2010, with its implications for Austin. And let's just sort of start right away with this fact that the United States today is a nation that is characterized by apartheid. We built racial apartheid in the United States on purpose from the founding of the country, and we kept building it and building it for centuries. It's visible in the colors on this map, well, a little visible from where you sit, at the national scale, with blue dots, which represent white, non-Hispanic people, dominating most of the map. Green dots, which represent African Americans, visible in a swath that represents the segregated and high poverty counties of the Black Belt in the South. And small dots of red and orange, the Asian and Latino populations who live predominantly in larger cities and metropolitan areas. So we can see this at the national scale. We can see it across parts of the community, from one side of the community to another, like here in Austin on the left, and within neighborhoods in big cities like New York City. We know that we did this on purpose now more than ever, and that numerous mechanisms were used by government, by private individuals, and by businesses to segregate cities deliberately. One of my favorite recent examples is from a terrific book. The examples that I learned about recently is from a terrific recent book by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law. And he told the story about Austin, about how in Austin, in the western part of the city, there used to be neighborhoods that were racially integrated. And when racial zoning was ruled unconstitutional in 1917 by the Supreme Court, not on civil rights grounds, but on the basis of free markets, that contracts shouldn't be impeded by a local regulation like that, they never touched the schools. So with segregated schools, the decision makers in Austin knew that they could make a decision. They could just put the black school on the other side of town. So all the parents of the African American kids, if they wanted their kids to have access to a public education, they had to move. So decisions like this, large and small, by private individuals and by government, built America as a segregated place that we see right now. It's not an accident. It's not an unfortunate byproduct of otherwise prosperous and progressive times. It's something that we did on purpose. We also have high and rising levels of inequality between the rich and the poor in the United States. with the top 1 and 0.1% of households earning more and more of the income and separating themselves from low-income people to rising and alarming extent everywhere in the United States. Now, we know, based on decades of research, that some of the outcomes or manifestations of this separation are very damaging to certain segments of the population and to certain people. We know that children who grow up in high-poverty neighborhoods have worse schools, are subject to higher levels of pollution and crime in their neighborhoods, and over their life course, because of the neighborhood conditions that they grow up in, are likely to earn less money. The unearned income that those young people would otherwise earn is not just a cost to themselves and their families, but to the nation. And it's a consequence of ongoing public-private decisions. It doesn't stop there, though, because if you own a business, if you own land, or if you own a house in one of these neighborhoods, you can't really expect as high a rate of appreciation in your property. You may not be able to afford the upkeep and maintenance. You may not be able to get a loan to improve your property. And sometimes then you neglect your property, and perhaps you just wait until the property becomes more attractive to some other buyer. You evict the tenants, and then you move a more prosperous business in. So you either get a cycle of disinvestment, or you get a cycle of disinvestment and then a cycle of eviction and displacement. And of course, the public services in high-poverty neighborhoods, we know, just by looking, suffer from inferior quality, from the parks and the streets and the sidewalks to the schools and other facilities. So we know that concentrated poverty from this decades of research is damaging for people and for communities. We don't know enough yet about concentrated wealth, neighborhoods of privilege that Robert Reich noticed over 20 years ago and called the secession of the successful. This process of seceding successful people is subsidized by all of us through the form of the mortgage interest deduction and state and local property tax exemptions. And when people form rich enclaves, the very fact of there being a bunch of rich people living together means that their properties go up in value more rapidly. So their ability to wall themselves off allows them to capture more of our tax dollars for themselves while we starve affordable housing and other important programs of the revenue that they should get. We don't know whether this is true, but people have speculated that, for example, having very rich neighborhoods could be damaging and harmful for the middle class, limiting their economic mobility, perhaps limiting intergenerational transfer of wealth, and maybe, at least anecdotally, isolating affluent and politically powerful people from mainstream real America, thereby distorting their perspective on what's really happening and what we really need to do to face the challenges of the 21st and 22nd centuries. So we know that some things, and we have some ideas about some others. I want to talk now about a project called the Cost of Segregation that the Urban Institute has been working on for a couple of years with colleagues from the Metropolitan Planning Council in Chicago, which, despite the name, is not a government body. It's a nonprofit that works with support from corporate and philanthropic sources. So MPC asked us a question that seemed pretty straightforward. Do we all pay something for segregation? Does everybody in a metropolitan area experience a deficit, a hit in some way because we're segregated by race and by income? And so the Urban Institute took data from the top 100 metropolitan areas in the United States from 1990, 2000, and 2010, and we studied this question. We measured how segregated they are, and we measured outcomes in income, in education, in homicide rates, and in life expectancy. And just asked the question, are the more segregated neighborhood, metropolitan areas, coming out with worse metropolitan outcomes in all these four things. And we found out that the answer is yes, that segregation does damage everybody in a metropolitan area, and moreover, if you look to find out whether segregation is actually helpful for any subset of the population, in particular white non-Hispanics, we did not find special benefits for white non-Hispanics being delivered from segregation. So metros suffer, and no one group wins from segregation. That's the result of this report, which came out last March, and you can find it just by Googling Urban Institute Cost of Segregation if you want to read more about it. So that was our side of the publication. But in order to sort of ground these national figures about segregation, we worked with the Metropolitan Planning Council to quantify those costs for Chicago. So what is it, like, you know, $2.50, or is it something more? And what we found in Chicago was that the combination of economic and African-American white segregation that they have there, which are extremely high in the United States among metros, reduces African-Americans' incomes enough to cost the entire region $4.4 billion every single year in income that the region would have if its segregation levels were at the national median levels. $4.4 billion is the dividend that Chicago could reap simply by bringing its levels of segregation down to national median levels. That's the gain. But there's also a cost beyond the cost in lost income, in lost potential of people who are growing up in that region, because both whites and African Americans in Chicago are less likely to get a college education because the region's African Americans and whites are so segregated. In fact, it amounts to 83,000 people in Chicago would otherwise have a college degree had Chicago had, in 2010, the national level of segregation between African Americans and whites. And most tragically, segregation results in lost lives in Chicago. Chicago's African American white segregation levels are high enough to associate with a 30% higher homicide rate. And in Chicago alone, that adds up to 229 lives in 2016. Than it would have if it had the national median level of segregation. But the Metropolitan Planning Council was not interested in stopping with another depressing report about how horrible segregation is and how much it's costing Chicago. They wanted to do something about it because they know, as you all know, that we did it on purpose. And if we did it on purpose, and if we work hard together, persistently, over time, we can build something different. From the start, they've been working with engaged members of their community to try to understand what the community wants to do to make Chicago not just more integrated, but more inclusive and more equitable. And they made this decision. And so the next move by Metropolitan Planning Council, which I'm going to preview here, asking you please not to tweet the results of the next slide, because it'll just sort of spoil their party. Their report's coming out in April with what they're recommending to the Chicago region. But let me just sort of put it up with that request. And to say this, they have a portfolio of probably 60 different programs and policies and actions. And I'm just so pleased that you all are meeting here today to talk about such a wide range of initiatives that need to be taken, that have been taken, that are being taken already right here in Austin, that are encompassing in this way. The issue areas really break down for them into three main areas. The first one in Chicago is talking about dismantling structural racism. It's not about integrating neighborhoods, because in Chicago, in communities of color, as may be the case here too, The idea that you need to add white people to a neighborhood that's been predominantly African American for its whole history is insulting, and it's unacceptable, especially if what that means is that the people who've always had power will move into neighborhoods and take the power away and the resources away from the people who live there already. They're often the targets of white power and not necessarily the beneficiaries of strong working relationships among and across races. So they and their community members really wanted to understand and make everyone understand that integration without inclusion is just a non-starter, that integration without equity and justice are a non-starter. But at the same time, it's important in Chicago for them to work to increase both the opportunity in low-income neighborhoods and mobility into high opportunity neighborhoods as well. So a set of their policies works on that. And a final set of their policies is about shrinking the racial wealth gap. Across all of these, issues of criminal justice, workforce and economic development are equally important with initiatives on the housing side. And that's one of the reasons why it's so exciting for me to see all of the issues you're going to be talking about here. So what about Austin? Well, I can't help myself. I always throw myself into a little bit of research. And one of the things I wanted to know was, well, Austin has grown a lot in population. It's very prosperous. How does that add up in this metropolitan area in terms of the total amount of money that's flowing around in people's pockets, at least what they report on the census? Between 2007 or so and 2014 alone, 7 years, the real aggregate income of everybody who lives in Austin grew by almost 20%. 7 years, 20%. That's some serious money. That's some serious prosperity, and that's some serious pressure on your housing markets. You got that much more money, it's flowing into a limited stock of housing. That means the housing's going to get more expensive. Same story in the suburbs. That's a lot of prosperity, and that's and the future here. And this is work that Urban Institute has been doing on a platform that I'm working on called Mapping America's Futures, to figure out how growth across the United States is going to come down in some places much more strongly than others. Austin and its metropolitan area could grow by 800,000 more people between 2010 and 2030. You probably have your own projections. And that's going to be white non-Hispanics and Latinos. It's going to be Asians. It's going to be African Americans. It's a multiracial growth pattern, and it's people of all ages. And it's going to be an unstoppable force because there's so many people who are aged 20 to 49 who are growing in this community, and those young people make more young people. It's not just people moving in from somewhere else. It's young people who came here, who want to raise families here, and they're from all parts of the spectrum. So if Austin wants to continue to prosper, it needs to think about a new reality. You can't count on the rest of the United States to send you their well-educated people any longer. You have to look from within. Because not only that, the rest of the United States is going to need those kids, too, to move out from Austin into places that don't have as much privilege. And there are problems to work on here, as you know. Segregation by income in Austin is high. It's higher than the national median by our measures. And it's almost as bad as Dallas now by this measure. It's a little better than Fort Worth. So that's something to work on because economic segregation is costly to everyone. Segregation between Latinos and whites in Austin is also above the national median. And one message that we did not work with MPC on in Chicago was the association between high levels of Latino white segregation and lower life expectancies. So high levels of Latino white segregation may be costing people's longevity as well. Segregation between African Americans and whites is comparatively low in Austin. I think perhaps in part because Austin's African American community has been dispersing to other locations. But I'm interested to hear more in your perspective on that. Another issue that's equally important is that income inequality, which is one of the drivers of economic segregation, the gap between the incomes of the top and the incomes of the bottom, is rising fast in Austin. Again, it's not as high as the national median, but it's going in the wrong direction. So I want to close just with a few principles and then take your questions and your comments. And that's that there are things, and this really repeats, I think, a lot of what's already been said by the mayor and the county judge and others today, so maybe I can go even faster. But the first key message, I think, is that this region can and must use growth to drive inclusion. That means doing things that planners like to do, like planning, development, and building infrastructure, that planners aren't so good at always doing, which includes increasing predictability. So once the plan is out, let people do what the plan says you can, so that you accommodate growth. And then something that few cities do, make sure that the benefits and the costs of that growth are distributed equally and evenly, and in a way that remedies past injustice instead of simply replicating it. Second, of course, is building inclusive neighborhoods and communities. And the tagline, the mission of HousingWorks Austin is perfectly like this. But making a home for everyone in every neighborhood also means making them feel at home in every neighborhood. And that gets into a sense that you belong, that you're entitled to be there, regardless of whether the color of your skin or your income. It's about your neighborhood, it's about your neighbors, it's about the businesses there, and it's about the forces of law and order as well. Growing the middle class is a third important thing that you all are really working on hard, not just on the workforce side, but starting before babies are even born. So their mothers and fathers get access to maternal health and preparation, all the way through until they get into the workforce. Aligning the public systems and the private providers and businesses so that there's a pathway to the middle class for low-income households, and also building a fair playing field for people to get access to credit. And then finally, and I think really critically for this region and for the state, tackling these really serious divides, the partisan divides between local governments that know they have problems to solve and want to work on them in an innovative way, and a state government that wants to keep them from doing that. It's going to be absolutely necessary for the city of Austin to be out of the crosshairs and to be working in coalition with lots of other local governments. And I'm delighted to hear the county judge talk about her initiative along those lines. But businesses, too, and other forces of society also really need to work together regionally so that it's not just an Austin conversation. It's a Central Texas, and it's a Texas-wide conversation about doing all these things. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
I've got a question over here, Rolf.
And could you tell me who you are before you start talking to, please?
Certainly. Follow your research, PhD student at University of Texas at Arlington, Urban Planning and Public Policy. I work as a researcher on the North Texas Regional Housing Assessment. We have 20 members of our consortium. I noticed that one of the recommendations was to work in regions for comprehensive housing assessments, and I wondered what you thought were the most important things that housing authorities and cities could be doing together to address segregation and affordable housing access.
Well, I think you just answered your own question. I think it's working together. To me, the message from the Metropolitan Planning Council's work is not, we've got a great toolbox here, it's yours. It's, we're working together in coalition to achieve better results. We have our eyes on inclusion and equity here. And these are the tools that seem like they're great strategies right now. We've talked about them. Some of them we've invented, some of them we've taken. You can find a lot of them just by Googling, right? What you can't find by Googling is political will. You find the political will by engaging your community, by building support with the actors and the forces who want inclusion and equity, building those coalitions and constituencies so that the communities, the city officials who are working together on a regional assessment of fair housing, as they are in metropolitan Chicago, and some other regions are too, are seriously committed to doing that. The state of California Housing and Community Development Director, Ben Metcalf, has made a commitment that that whole state is going to still implement the affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate, which is nice since it's been the law since 1968, right? I mean, come on. It's still an obligation, and we can't meet that obligation one jurisdiction at a time. But people aren't going to do it just because it's nice. People need a reason, and people need to be, their feet needs to be held to the fire. And that's political organizing as well as knowledge being generated at the same time, as well as some solutions and examples from other places. But it has to start with the political process of engagement. And that's something, frankly, that MPC can do because it's not a government agency. And so that's sort of a question mark for me, is HousingWorks, is some other organization that's not sitting in government and therefore constrained. What role is there for other intermediary organizations here to work in coalition to do that kind of building so that the efforts are constant, are engaged, and are not subject to preemption?
Hi, Ann Beeson, Center for Public Policy Priorities. As we work together as a nonprofit community and community activists, can you say a little bit more about the accountability tools and mechanisms that you have seen work to ensure race equity in, as cities and counties consider potential changes, right? Because it's one thing to have political will, but it's another thing to sort of actually have something to suggest that the city or the county or whoever must do in order to analyze the impact on current segregation, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
I'm always stumped by questions like this. I just have to confess. Which communities have done, this or that? Because, what you're asking for is actually two things. One, which communities have made the commitment? And then two, what's built into those commitments so that we know they're serious? I know precious few communities that have even done the first one, made a serious commitment, because report after report after report comes out that just shows us how bad segregation is or concentrated poverty is, as if it were just, like the sedimentary layers, right? Okay, that's what it is. That's the terrain that we have to play on, right? That if we start thinking, no, we built it and we can change it, it's then that you start building those programs that say, here's how we're going to change it deliberately, and then move in with a program and a set of accountability mechanisms. So I don't know. Do you?
There are tools that have been developed that are policy analysis tools that help us know what the impact of certain decisions are. And so, that would be one suggestion, is to look at those.
So, as somebody who works at a think tank, who does a lot of evaluation, I absolutely share a commitment to data-driven decision-making, which means managing the change process using data. And so it's essential that and that MPC and its partners know, are the policies that it's embracing working? And if not, it's not like, oh, we're going to stop, right? They're just going to stop doing this or change this or do something else, right? So I do think the community indicators partnerships, National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, one of which is here in Austin, CI Now in San Antonio, and others are offering mechanisms. Again, government, sort of outside government for the most part, sustaining that monitoring and measurement effort and elevating our understanding about what's happening in particular neighborhoods. So there are definitely examples of those kinds of platforms. Are there examples that show persistent attention to a program for inclusion and equity? I don't know, maybe Denver is working on that some with their equity indicators. So, again, I'm answering this partly by saying that's not my specialty, is remembering those great examples. let's talk later, and I can maybe get some ideas from you.
I have a comment right here. Hi.
Oh, hi.
Vanessa Sadia. So I've worked on indicators projects at the community level and at the local level, and what I have found is that having worked in local government, that the policies take a long time to enact. A lot of these plans discussed have been talked about for decades. And what's happening at the local level, what's happening in the neighborhood level is moving so much faster than the policies that are, we're able to affect at a grander level. So I want to first thank you for mentioning more of the place-based indicators, because those are really important, although we don't have a lot of data. But it's almost like we need somebody paying attention to what's happening in those neighborhoods, because there's so many policies that converge. So I was wondering if you knew of communities that are able to kind of do that.
Some of these very National Neighborhood Indicators partnerships. So the NNIP is a group of 35 community indicators projects in cities across the United States. In Eric Sullivan's community in Denver, it's the Piton Foundation. So there's in 35 different places. And right now we have a cross-site exploration and study of the partners who are working the hardest on indicators of neighborhood change that are much more up to date and much more granular than the ones that are being provided by 5-year average Census Bureau data, which are really out of date and sometimes suspect from the day that they're issued. And I use census data for this research, so I know that I'm saying that you need to take my own research with a grain of salt there. But Detroit has been really working hard on making sure that it's monitoring what's going on. They've done a lot of innovation in that respect. The partner in Cleveland has some really interesting ways of measuring neighborhood change. And their ways of measuring change have been able to link individual records over time. And they've found out that you can trace directly from a foreclosure to a housing flip, to a little child being poisoned by lead, to that child doing badly in kindergarten and having behavioral issues and learning issues when they're in first, second, and third grade. So that's gathering data at the neighborhood level and understanding that there is a cost to children, and we shouldn't have to go to the public cost before we do something about that. So there are many examples of these kinds of initiatives that are about trying to track real-time data. But again here, it takes trust among agencies to allow their data to be shared and matched in that way. Why would a hospital share their data with the juvenile justice system or the child welfare system, right? Those systems don't always talk to each other. Sometimes states don't even allow it. Washington State built a whole state database to allow them to do more of that work, but that's at the state level. At the local level, you need organizations that allow people to come together to solve problems that require data. Our problem is not we don't have enough data. We have too much data. We're living in an era of data overload, but it's all locked up into everybody's little pieces. And it's hard to make sense of it all. So we need to think differently about how we use data for decision making. We need to ask, what do we want to do? Who needs to be involved in those actions? And then what data do they have to help us get a handle on it? And how can we use those data creatively so we can drive the solutions? And in a city like this one, where you're innovating exactly in these areas, Austin really ought to be an example that everyone knows about. And I hope you get to be that way. Maybe you already are and I don't even know it.
One more over here.
Hi, thanks for being here. Greg Anderson, Austin Habitat for Humanity. So I love your slide about build inclusive neighborhoods and communities. You may have heard we're rewriting our land development code, something locally called Code Next, last written in 1984. And right now there seems to be a tremendous amount of resistance as far as getting missing middle into the more established high opportunity neighborhoods. When a lot costs $600,000 and all we can build today is 2 homes, there was a big push to maybe get more homes and have one of those to be an affordable housing bonus unit that's income restricted, big A affordability. Any suggestions on how to get through the impasse and get better by right development that's more predictable and allow more development in these high opportunity areas?
I guess, first what I'd say is I don't know enough about where else Code Next channels development. But to the extent that a subset of neighborhoods might feel like it's being asked to do more than its share to accommodate growth, that can really erode trust and undermine progress. If super affluent neighborhoods on the west side are able to block the introduction of new housing, and well-situated neighborhoods that are still high-opportunity neighborhoods closer into town are the areas that are left standing after historic areas are ruled out, and after historic low-income neighborhoods also get protected. It's going to be a problem when you're trying to add 800,000 people to your metropolitan area. And so I think, I guess I'm sort of leading with information that I've just got anecdotally, but my sense is that those bargains have not yet been struck in ways that allow people to feel like everybody's bearing both the burdens and the costs of the growth, at least in one previous draft of Code Next, which may be superseded now by a new one coming out. So I think that's what I'd say, and it's also obviously not just a City of Austin issue. It goes into the unincorporated area, into some of the smaller municipalities, up to Georgetown and Round Rock. It goes down to San Marcos and New Braunfels. Really it goes all along the Interstate 35 corridor. So trying to fight these issues one neighborhood at a time in Austin is really going to slow things down when you have this much growth and prosperity to work with.
Hi, I'm Ann Bedour with Texas Appleseed, and we talk a lot about data analytics and using it to measure how successful policies are in making the changes we want them to make. And I'm curious, from your perspective and experience, what's a reasonable timeline? Because sometimes there's going to be some bumpiness in how things play out. Is it a 5-year time frame? Like, what is the kind of time frame that we need to be looking at as we assess and reassess our policies?
I think it really depends a lot on your expectations and your logic model, as they say, of how long, when do you expect the payoff to happen? If you expect, for example, that a home visiting program can improve maternal health and child health because you're doing it, then you should be able to see, if you ramp up your home visiting program, within a year, that you have some measurable results for the moms and the babies who are involved in that kind of a program. If you're talking about building a neighborhood that's inclusive and diverse, that's a much longer time frame. So you really need to match, I think, the measurement systems and the indicators you're looking at to the scale, the time scale at which you expect them to need to occupy. Because otherwise you may be expecting immediate results when it's just going to take a lot longer. Then that means looking for nearer term signs of success and that you're moving things in the right direction. Sometimes those are even in the forms of just plans and conversations that happen. So I don't know if you're looking for like the single time frame or indicator. I don't think there is one, but I think the impulse that you and others have had, that we want to be data-driven in the decision-making, in the planning, in the policy development, thinking about evaluation, not in hindsight, but as we are developing the programs to start and asking the question, well, we want to enact this policy, we want to implement this program, we want to make this investment. Why do we think that's going to work in a certain way, and how can we design it so we can test whether it's working in that way? That will make for smarter policies and investments and actions from the start, because if you know that you can't measure the success, maybe you need to go back to work on your logic model, and maybe you need to go back to work on the programs and the policies that you think are going to be helpful. So that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for your attention and for your invitation. It's been delightful to be here with you today.